I'm not. No, I do every once in a while. I do something.
Jeremy, as a punishment, will sit next to me.
I can sit next to you as a punishment.
I think Elizabeth, you should be here.
Would you like me to sit by
Yes.
So let's get started.
Where should I be?
No, you are perfect. You are perfect.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. On behalf of the American Spring Festival, welcome to one of its accompanying events, which is a discussion about Americans in the Czech Republic. Incredible as it may seem, this year we will celebrate 3 decades from the Velvet Revolution. And it's exactly 30 years ago, or about, that Americans started to come to this country in large numbers. People from all walks of life, who some of them stayed for a short time, some of them for a longer time, some of them never left. And they started to work in this country together with Czechs, and I must say I personally have worked at the American Embassy since 1990 for 28 years. And I saw that happening as Americans really were instrumental in setting up the Czech NGO sector. They created incredible projects together with Czech artists, cultural figures. They, of course, built some educational cooperations that last until today. They were in commercial sector, and, of course, there were many journalists involved. And they informed all. They told people about this, and they kind of built the profile of the Czech Republic as well. And they maybe made some Americans come to the country and stay also. So today we will speak about all this, and we have some representatives of the journalists who have been here for a shorter or longer time. They will tell you themselves. And that is Elizabeth Haas from the Expats, Jeremy Drucker from Transitions Online, Director and Editor-in-Chief, and Evan Rail, writer for the New York Times and other publications. Of course, the moderator is not American, but she is a Czech reporter with an extensive and very rich American experience, Veronika Bednářová, who will lead the discussion tonight. So, before I close, there is a poster of the American Spring Festival. There are still some events that you might visit, especially in the Jazz Dog. And this is it for now, and join me in welcoming the panelists. Thank you very much.
Markéta, thank you very much. Welcome everyone in this beautifully air-conditioned space of the Václav Havel Library. It's, of course, not a coincidence we are meeting here. When we were sort of talking about the panel for the first time with Markéta, we didn't know we were going to invite those 3 distinctive American journalists. We were sort of wanting to invite people who tell stories. And I think these 3 people were telling their stories, or are telling their stories, so beautifully and precisely that it actually helped a great deal with the transition, right, Jeremy, from the communist regime into the democratic and free press media. And they were helping us, the Czech journalists, a great deal as well, to learn from them and to be our mentors in a way. So I want to talk about both sides today, both about them, the American journalists and finding their stories here, but also about how they view kind of us and the contemporary Czech culture and politics and other things. We will talk a little bit also how the Czechs see the American community. There'll be obviously a space for your questions towards the end. If somebody feels like a real need or urge to ask a question during the discussion that's possible also, because we are sort of in a nice community, in a nice family crowd. Before we start, I think it would be appropriate, because each of my guests have a completely different story. Elizabeth, for example, is a baby. She only came in 2005, so she basically, has nothing to say about the golden 90s. Evan came for the weekend in 1998, sort of to taste the beer and stuff, and then he joined again in 2000 for a year, right? And then
that's right.
you woke up after 19 years, kind of being surprised.
More or less, it's been a surprise, the whole thing.
And then kind of the founding father of the founding father of the Americans in Prague is Jeremy, who have heard in 1992, right, Jeremy, an interesting talk at your university doing your bachelor degree about that there is a place called Prague when there's going to be a conference about this transition from the kind of communist press into the new democratic press, not only in the Czechoslovakia, but in the whole Central and Eastern European region. And he was like, okay, maybe I could go and see what's there about. And then he stayed here for 3 years and came only back to Harvard to finish his master's degree in international affairs, and then came back again in 1997. And basically this very conference in 1992 started his career in creating a platform in helping those sort of Eastern Central European journalists sort of to work where the press cannot be completely free, as they are a lot of places. So if you want to tell a few words about yourself first before we start.
Yeah, sure. Hello. So I'm Elizabeth, and I am the editor at Expats CZ, but I've been here since about 2005. However, my career started in New York in 1997, where I worked for a series of women's magazines reporting on nutrition and health and food and eventually fashion and beauty. And I came to Prague in 2005 and was working kind of independently and freelance and doing several different projects, and then actually met my husband, and so that was one of the main reasons that I ended up staying for as long as I have. But I will say that in terms of the transition that we're talking about, I think that the site that I work for kind of represents what has always been a resource, and it's been around, I think, since like 2001. It started as just a really simple message board, and it was kind of connecting the expat community with services and things that they hadn't quite overcome the language barrier or whatever. So it was more of a resource at that time, and it's evolved quite a bit, and so has our readership, and so has the definition of an expat, and I hope we'll talk about that a little bit more.
I'll steal the microphone, maybe, and you can, because you guys will be much better off with this one.
Okay. Great. My name's Evan. I'm a freelance food and travel writer. I've been living in Prague for about 19 years, which seems strange. But I first came here a couple of years before that. I spent a summer here, 2 summers, 98 and 99. And just sort of gradually adapted, like some kind of animal finding a special niche that it can live in. And I found a really nice niche for myself here. I feel really, really good about living in the Czech Republic. I think in some ways it's interesting that we have a better opinion in a way of the country in which we've chosen to live, maybe than people who were born here. But
much better.
Yeah, I love it here. I think it's a great country, and I'm really happy to write stories. I generally write about food and drink and travel. Sometimes from the Czech Republic, about half the time from the Czech Republic, about half the time from other spots around Europe. I write for the New York Times. I had a story about Holešovice in the Wall Street Journal about a month ago, and I just try to write wherever I can about interesting things or things that I find interesting about culture and life in the Czech Republic.
You might find interesting that Evan is also the biggest Czech beer specialist. I think no Czech beer drinker can compare to him, and he also wrote a book called Why Beer Matters. Highly recommend. Jeremy? Thank you.
So, thank you. You gave a nice introduction before, but I do feel very old when you say I'm one of the founding fathers. But there were a lot of journalists here before me, but a lot of them ended up leaving. So I guess
Right,
I'm one
right.
of those who've consistently been here for a long time. But I got here, as you said, right soon after school, and it was almost by chance. I, as you said, became interested in the whole transition of the media from a communist press to an independent press, and there happened to be 6 of us from my graduating class who came to Prague in around that time, 91, 92. We graduated in 91. So it
It was
was,
like an infection.
yeah, I mean, it's hard. I tell my students today, like for them to imagine there were tens of thousands of us here at that time. So this was really part of that first wave. And I ended up staying. I was working for an NGO, helping with the transition, working as a reporter for a weekly, which no longer exists, which at the time was called Prognosis, which is more of a longer in-depth stories and culture and arts and all of that, competing with the Prague Post. Then, as you said, went back to graduate school for 2 years because I felt I didn't really have enough of a background in the region or any kind of economic coursework, and then came back and have been here since '97. So I was very lucky to have an internship when I was in grad school at our print predecessor, which was called Transitions Magazine, and then got hired out of school to come back. My girlfriend, now wife, is Czech, so we had wanted to come back. So there was a great opportunity. I don't think we really thought about that we'd just end up staying here, but that's the way how sometimes things work out.
Thank you very much. I would maybe sort of take the journey a little bit backwards and start about the contemporary status of the Americans in Prague, American journalists in Prague. How do you guys find stories in a country which is so boring as Czech Republic? Like, we are in NATO, we are still part of the EU. Besides some hard news scandals, not much is happening, really. I mean, especially, Evan, not for the title page of the New York Times. So how do you, Elizabeth, with like 2 little children being born in this country, find stories?
Well, I think there's a quote by the great American writer Nora Ephron, or maybe it was her mother who said it, and she said, "Everything is copy." And I firmly believe that, and especially in terms of what I cover, comes out of my own experience, and there's never a dull moment living this life, and by virtue of the fact that I'm here, it's often enough to write about that, to write about, giving birth in a Czech hospital, going through maternity leave,
That's
sending
great.
my kids off
That's for a
to-
book, right?
Yeah, sending my kids at the age of 4 off to Školka v Přírodě, which to me is just like mind-blowing that you send your kids off it. So I think that's,
Why? Because they are too young, or
yeah,
what's?
because they're so young. I don't think anyone in America would sign off on
it's,
that.
it's pretty weird. My Jones just got back on Friday. So.
Yeah, so exactly. So I think that, for me at least, and I'm not, certainly not pitching for the New York Times, but I'm just kind of, everything that I write about is largely born out of my own experiences, and I just think stories are everywhere and easy to find.
Yeah, I remember when I used to read Express. There was a lot about like where to cut your hair or where to do cosmetics.
Yeah.
So it really, your
was,
presence really helps,
Yeah,
because
it
there
was.
are like real stories now.
It was functional at the time, and I think we have evolved. And I have to say that I was just, prior to this, looking at some stats and seeing what like the historically the most popular articles were, and the most popular article of all time was like 10 reasons to give Czech men a chance.
I would like to read that.
Yeah, and then the second one was just, I actually wrote about, my relationship with Czech women. And that was a challenge to be
It was also translated. Sorry, it was translated into Ona Dnes big article. And
It got picked up by Ona i Dnes, and it was just literally about my experience with befriending Czech women and how it was hard for me because I felt they were different and kind of the things that I liked about them without, grossly stereotyping. But so everything is happy.
Evan, there's like just under 8 million tourists in Prague, and it feels like everything was already written about Prague and other tourist places. So after after 14 years of working for the New York Times, like how do you find new and interesting stories, angles, and
Well,
how
so
do you pitch them?
in general, cities, never stay the same. There's a really famous quote from Baudelaire about how a city changes faster than the heart of a mortal. And the old Paris is dead, and he was complaining about Paris being ruined in 1857. Nowadays people would think that the good Paris was 10 years ago or 100 years ago, and he was saying it was before 1857 when everything got ruined. People have been complaining about cities changing for millennia, and that's just the nature of the beast. They're always evolving. So if you live in a city like Prague, you can write a story about the best restaurants in Prague, and it'll be different every year. Especially in places like Prague, because so much has been in flux because there were fewer things that were, I think, long-lasting standards in the world of food and drink. There weren't those really great, wonderful Michelin-starred restaurants after '89. Everything is kind of started from scratch in terms of food and drink. So there's a lot of newness, and there's a lot of new neighborhoods developing, and there are a lot of interesting trends. A lot of those trends are just kind of global trends, where
What's your latest story for the New York Times in your computer?
I have two. One's on night trains, which only tangentially touches on České dráhy. Has night trains that go all the way out to far eastern Slovakia. Actually, it's a RegioJet, I think, or RegioJet, that does the student agency. And then České dráhy goes to Zurich. But I have a story about Olomouc as an alternative to Prague, because my editors thought that Prague was over-touristed. And this kind of gives you I was saying before, it gives you an idea of how maybe Americans don't really know what they're talking about when they're talking about Prague. My editors were convinced that tourism in Prague was like in Barcelona, which has 20 million tourists a year, and Prague has under 8 million. It's 7.5 or something million tourists came last year to Prague. They're roughly the same size. Barcelona's a little bit bigger, but Prague doesn't suffer from the same amount of over-tourism that Barcelona does. My editors were convinced that they were basically the same. And to be honest, my editors probably think they're about 100 miles apart, so it's not something that most Americans can speak to. Where is the Czech Republic? What is the Czech Republic? Where is Prague? And so forth. So I think there are some misconceptions.
Jeremy, talking about sort of more like international reporting and the hard news, you being once called the enemy of the state by by one of the ministers in the Mečiar's government back in the 90s during the mafia times. Like, how do you find those stories, and how do you actually report them, maybe with a little bit of limitation of the language, which you guys maybe used to have, when you first came? Or how do you do that?
You mean today? Today, yeah. Well,
Yes.
unfortunately, I have to sit too much in an office, and I'm not doing the reporting anymore. But we have people now that are on the ground in all of these countries. We cover about 30 countries across Central and Eastern Europe. It's in English, and it used to be a print magazine, and now it's an online website. So we've always prided ourselves on trying to use local reporters to write stories that would be less likely to be seen in the international press. Obviously, in many of these countries, it's quite a repressive environment. So sometimes we use pseudonyms, sometimes we have to be just very careful about revealing identities of some of the sources and stuff like that. But obviously the situation in the Czech Republic is very different from a lot of those countries where we work. So we'll only partially cover the Czech Republic, but the farther you go east, the farther you go south, unfortunately the situation is just as bad as it was 20 years ago.
So you do also
Maybe worse, yeah.
Yeah, and you do special training first for those journalists before sending them out there, right?
Yeah, I mean, usually we're using people on the ground. So we're not really sending out American journalists or Czech journalists.
Right.
But we do have stories by people who, like are here on the panel. I mean, others who know the country well, who will write their stories. But I would say 75 or 80% of the stories are written by locals who know the situation, know the dangers involved.
Thank you. Are there, Elizabeth, any sort of isolating factors in your work? Like maybe too many things you guys sometimes don't understand, or maybe a little bit of a frustration on
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think.
certain Czech features of
Yeah, I mean, I think just by virtue of living in a foreign country, a lot of that can be isolating, no matter what your profession. In terms of particulars, yeah, I mean, I think it's difficult when you're sourcing news or looking for interesting stories if you don't read the language or understand the language or read the language. It can be a challenge as well. But I mean, I have come up against, trying to kind of parse out these stories, which I call cultural landmines, in which we often deal with on our site, which is,
like what?
well, yeah. But I mean, for us, culture clash is really, it's our readers, they just love it. They want to know the differences and they want to compare. And so a lot of things that we choose to cover, or even that I see chosen in the American media, don't really get touched much by the Czech media. So I think one of the issues that I remember writing about in recent years was this Czech television show that uses blackface. And it's like
Makes a white person black by using the color.
Exactly, something like that, or a Czech
That's not
company.
cool.
Yeah, you don't know the show. It's insane. Yeah, really,
It's a singing show.
it's on TV Nova, and I called TV Nova, and I said I want to interview.
I want an explanation.
Yes, tell me now. But they were really, as soon as they found out like what the angle of the story and what I wanted to ask them and what I wanted to talk to them about, they wouldn't return my calls. So they were very excited to be covered. But then when I kind of wanted to delve into a bit, but that because to them it just wasn't even an issue. And so
So you see things Czechs don't see,
yeah,
basically.
I do, and I think that can kind of, it often leads to these clashes as well, and generates a huge amount of discussion among your readership, and who kind of want explanations for these things. So, I mean, but I think it's good to have the talk and to start the talk.
Yeah, no, so maybe us, by reading your articles, we can also understand, us better.
Yeah, I mean, we have a huge Czech readership. I think we've, just looking at our traffic and analyzing our traffic, it is a lot of Americans and Brits, but it's also a lot of Czechs who want to see how we see them and who want to practice their English and who want to read, because a lot of people that come to our site, English is their second or third language, and so, we do a bit more simplistic kind of conversational tone, but we don't shy away from issues that are going to elicit discussion. So, yeah.
Well, what I like about Evan's stories in the New York Times is that they are so democratic, that you really try to introduce kind of topics which everybody can do in terms.
Oh yeah, yeah.
So is there something kind of frustrating for you in terms of this Czech culture of us maybe being, a bit selfish or?
One of the things, the only thing that comes to mind about that's frustrating in terms of finding stories and the Czech culture is that too often things that are really great are not taken seriously by natives here. And so you need somebody to come from abroad and say, no, really.
Mushroom picking is great.
Český ráj is a beautiful place. Czech beer is worth writing a book about.
Sorry for interrupting. I remember before you came on board, there were just all those articles about French cuisine and French wine and French cheeses, and we never read, about the Czech food ever.
So I used to work at the Prague Post, which competed with Prognosis. No fault of my own. You guys were already out of business when I got here. But I started the food section, or ran the food section there from 2000 to 2006, and I would read, or try to read, struggle through Czech food coverage, and it was very much French-based. Very much, wine is not good unless it's from France. Food is not good unless it's served with a really heavy sauce, and it's from France. And I'm here to tell you because I am the labušník, and I doporučuji. Whatever, that was the name of the
Italian.
that was the name of the column, is labušník doporučuji. And it was really a top-down kind of culinary culture, which is the same as any culture. It's a top-down culture where I will tell you what is good. But what has happened in American media in the past 50 years in terms of features writing about food and drink, is that it's become much more democratic. And you have food writers looking at street food and taking that seriously, and looking at maybe things that are not considered high class and writing about them with the same importance that we used to give haute cuisine and high value or highly expensive foods and drinks. So one of the things I did here was do some of that coverage, but it wasn't groundbreaking. I was just trying to be an American journalist here.
Yeah.
It just was completely different than the way Czech journalists were covering food and drink, which was very much French-based, very, very snooty and very highbrow. And it wasn't at all like, let's go talk about ramen, you know, which it is nowadays. It has changed as well. Czech media has changed in that way as well.
Slowly, but yeah, I agree. I
Yeah,
agree,
yeah.
actually. Yeah.
What do you think was the turning point for people kind of celebrating Czech food again? Was it a certain restaurant or
Yeah, no, so it was...
book?
I think it was when Olda Sahaidak got the Michelin star at La Dégustation.
Really?
Roland Bourgeois. I think that was one of the big ones, but you would see it before at certain restaurants. But I mean, I used to write restaurant reviews, and I would ask them if there's anything Czech on the menu, and I would beg them for something Czech, and they would go, "We can make this, you know, rollada."
Fried cheese.
No, well, fried cheese is very good. Don't, you know, Anthony Bourdain loved fried cheese here. You know, it was one of his favorite things. Fried cheese is fantastic. I think Local was a big step towards recognizing Local when that opened, and that was just perfectly timed for the economic crisis when it opened in 2008 to start serving lowbrow food, but in a really good way, and it wasn't expensive. Sahaidak moved from there and had this other restaurant. There's a big movement towards reappreciating Czech food, which I think is important too.
Thank you. Jeremy, in terms of this kind of hidden xenophobia, how do an American journalist
Yeah, I get
deal with it?
xenophobia.
Maybe not you specifically, but maybe your student, or you know.
How I didn't hear the other
How
part.
do they deal with it? How do they kind of explain it to the readers? Or how do you actually kind of uncover it from under the carpet?
Yeah, I mean, it's been an extremely difficult topic, and I think also for those of us who have lived here for a long time, I think the whole
Big jump from Local. I apologize.
yeah, I don't know how deeply we want to go into that topic, but I think for a lot of us who felt the country was perhaps beyond that, the economic crisis and everything that developed out of that, and the parties that are now in parliament and so on were rather disappointing. But in terms of teaching journalism about it, I think there have been huge changes in Czech journalism students from when I first got here. I think when I first got here and I would meet students, they would have difficulty articulating, hadn't traveled much, hadn't studied abroad, and now I've been really impressed. I mean, we can critique the journalism faculty still to some extent, but I think the students have dramatically changed, and I've been really impressed. We just launched a call for applications for students. We do training here for Czech students on how to better identify fake news, disinformation, fake photos, video, and to help track how it's spreading. And we got, I think, 40 applications. So there is this kind of thirst now among young Czech journalism students for information that they feel might not be offered through their faculties, and looking for it elsewhere. They speak really well, their English is very good, they've studied abroad, a lot of them. Unfortunately, because of the market, and we talked about this earlier, a lot of them end up going into marketing or PR and not staying in journalism. But I think we don't have to talk too much about covering, at least in the stuff we do in the big cities, Prague, Brno, Olomouc, about how better to cover minorities and migrants and all of that. I'm not saying everyone is of like mind, but it's really changed a lot for the better.
That's great to hear. Thank you. How do we treat you guys? How do the Czech journalists treat the Americans? Because, I mean, we also talked about it earlier, that it's kind of, we lived in our little boxes, you know, and if it wouldn't, for example, be of the Karlovy Vary Film Festival, where I work with a lot of American journalists, and I kind of admire some of them, and we are friends, I wouldn't probably, like, know work-wise you in a detailed way. Like there has been some collaboration a little bit for you with the Honored Nest, but also more like a random rather than I think regular, right? Why? I mean, are we supportive?
I don't know so much if it's random. I mean, I think we get called a lot when somebody wants a quote about, you know, something happening like the elections, or we often get asked, like, do you know anyone just an expat we can speak to about voting in Prague, or so I think that, I mean,
So as a resource, we are
Yeah.
using you in a good way.
exactly. But no, I mean, I think from my perspective at least, you know, I have a way different coverage area. I think that, you know, Czech journalists really value the international perspective, and most of them, at least that I work with, are wanting to promote it. I mean, in my situation, when I've had stories picked up by the Czech media, like they value the insight and want to share it with the community. So I feel like they are supportive. I kind of feel like more it's like the American journalism community that's pretty not like it's more.
You mean the,
like,
the expat community here? Or?
What I
Yeah,
mean,
because-
but what I mean, there hasn't been, for example, you know, a Czech publication who would offer you or Evan like some really stable,
No,
you know, exclusive collaboration.
I got that offer though. So
You got it offered.
yeah, but it was a complete surprise, which is I guess why it's noteworthy. When Lidovki was setting up its food section, Hanna Michopoulou asked me to be the food critic, and I had just done restaurant reviews for 6 years at the Prague Post, and I was done. I didn't want to do it, but I did get offered a job that way, and through certain channels, I do get some feedback from journalists. But if you're writing in English or German or Swahili, it's not going to be interesting to people here if they can't read it and they have other things to think about. In some ways, I mean, if the coverage,
I just guess like why we are not using sort of your knowledge, experience, and talent more, you know, rather than kind of selling it out to
it's
the
getting better.
to English.
From my point of view, it's getting better. I'm a journalist, so I live on Twitter, and
Right.
half of my Twitter followers are Czech writing Praguers, and I follow them to see their news, and I share it with my wife if I see something,
Right.
because some editor from Respect writes that some new story is happening, and so that kind of is getting better. But we're all isolated anyway. It's a part of the modern condition. We're bowling alone, and we live at home. We work in our little cupboards or desk in the bedroom, like I do, and we don't have as much contact with other human beings as we used to, especially if we're all freelancing.
True. Yeah. Jeremy, how do we treat you?
We have quite good cooperation with Czech media. So we're translating stories into English from a bunch of media. They're happy to do it. They're happy to be seen in English. They traditionally don't have capacity to translate stories into English. I've been here a long time, so I have a lot of friends among Czech journalists. And I think, unfortunately, there's too little innovation from abroad being imported into the Czech scene.
Right.
I think that's a critical problem, and I think they see us as some kind of intermediary in a way with the training we do and the different trends that we're trying to introduce here, and trying to fill that gap. But yeah, I mean, it is a little strange, I guess, as you said, that maybe not more Czech media have columnists to offer a different perspective.
Like they should be proud of, you
Yeah.
know, those kind of exclusive collaborators.
Yeah, and I don't even know if I think at one point there were maybe some blogs that were on, maybe it was Eden S or others who had blogs written by foreigners that were here, because I do think it is an interesting perspective, but you don't see it that often. It's true.
I think Lidovki does a profile of a foreigner or something. They have pretty popular columns, a profile of someone from a different country.
Yeah.
It's also-
they change them, I think, every 6 months.
They also, I mean, this works in the world of media everywhere, but there are a couple talking heads who speak Czech.
Oh, yeah.
Who are then
Yeah,
like
yeah.
The favorites who are called like every time, like Eric Best.
Yes, Eric.
You know, even though Eric's opinions are not always, I would say,
Balanced.
you said that, not me. But he's a guy you'll see on TV a lot during, I don't know, election time and things like that, especially American elections.
I remember hearing a story from Jerzy Pehe, who said he had been interviewed so many times, he just said, call someone else.
Yeah.
Because he was so tired of being the talking head for every story. And
Yeah.
it seems like they're from actually in English language media
Yeah,
about,
that's true.
yeah, it's the other way.
Yeah, but then there are people like that.
I want to stay for a second with those new trends kind of being implemented from the US here. Like you said, it's not really, that fluent, but I think the solution journalism, which you guys are sort of introducing to the Czech scene right now, I think that's a good example of how the American media is influencing directly the Czech one, right?
Yeah.
If you can tell us a little bit
Yeah,
more about
so
it.
so we're trying to introduce this concept that has been around for a long time, but has been gaining steam in the U.S., which is called solutions journalism, with the idea that there's so much negativity in the news now, and people are depressed about reading so many stories about crime and corruption, everything bad happening in the world, and a lot of people are tuning out of the news. Also, they tend to then believe populists who come to power or try to come to power and say everything's terrible in the world, and people somehow agree with that because they've been reading that in the media so often. So there's a new stress across the US to write more stories that are constructive, that look deeply at answers and solutions rather than just problems. So not in an advocacy kind of way, but more saying, this is something which is working in one part of the world or in one city, why can't we do it here? So this is something we're trying to introduce. We have a grant for the whole Visegrad region. So we've been doing workshops here in the Czech Republic, trying to also hand out stipends to get these stories in the Czech media. And I think that's a good example where it's actually worked quite well. So we went in and
I think so too, yeah.
we did a workshop at Economia. They did a big, some of you might have seen a story about 2 months ago, a series of stories called Nejsi Sám, which was about male suicide in the Czech Republic, which is a big problem. So there were a series of stories talking about how other countries around the world are dealing with this issue, and it got a lot of discussion, a lot of play, and we'll be rolling out more stories over the course of the summer. So
I think Deník N also
Yeah.
was part of your workshop, right? This
Yeah,
new
yeah.
progressive kind of semi-online, semi-print magazine. That's
yeah, we also did a workshop
newspaper.
over there, and they'll be having some stories later in the year. So yeah, I think that's been a really positive experience so far.
Sorry, did you want to say something?
Well, I think in other ways, I think Czech media has caught up as well. I mean, we're seeing really good channels on YouTube that are Czech, that are just at the same production level and the same level of interest and the same level of.
Like what?
Cuketka's food stories are fantastic. They're little 2-minute stories about how to make Hrašková polívka or something, and
I love those.
they're really great. They're really cool.
He started an English one and didn't take off.
Really, I'm a subscriber. I think the Honest Guide for all his, good and bad sides has been really successful and really interesting, and doing something at a level that is being recognized internationally. And we have to admit that that's also media. That is where things are going and how things are working.
I think the last 30 years were very vibrant, not only in terms of the Americans coming and going, but also in terms of the publications coming and going, and closing, going under, changing from the print version into an online version, and
Oh yeah.
kind of losing jobs and leaving the country because of not having any job, and trying to translate from Czech to English and vice versa, not having enough journalism job. Not talking, of course, about the three of you guys, but in general, from the stories we know, and just sort of being freelancer for like way too long. So my question, I guess, is how sustainable is your job for the three of you, Elizabeth? How long this will all last?
I mean, like I said, it's a bit different for me because we are at our core a business as well, and we deal a lot with jobs and real estate, and those are really key areas. And we know that a lot of people are coming to Prague to look for jobs and homes, and there are an influx of people coming in, foreigners. I mean, the people who visit our site are not just Americans and Brits, they're largely French or German or Russian.
Right.
And due to the economy, due to the cost of living and the quality of life.
So your readership, in other words, is changing quite
Yeah,
drastically.
absolutely.
Okay.
And they're all looking for resources and jobs, and that expats, I think, is one of the first places that they come. So I think I hope my job is sustainable. Easy come, easy go. However, yeah, I think it's become, I mean, we don't really do hard news. We write news briefs, but it's become, I think, increasingly important to stand out and to cover some of these issues, because I think there has been an emboldening, just like it's happening in the States, of, these different factions that are emboldening these kinds of immigration sentiments and things like that. And it's all played out on social media in such an ugly way sometimes. So I hope that we'll be there to moderate that into the future.
It's actually interesting. Are also like immigrants your readers? Because I mean, what is really the difference between the expat and an immigrant?
This is the thing.
You know what I mean?
I've taken to calling myself an immigrant.
Yeah.
So
As
that's,
well.
that's a story. That's
I
its
think
own story.
it's unfortunate, because I think
Puzzling, right?
it is, and I think the notion of an expat is someone who lives in an enclave that's closed off, that's not integrated into the foreign community, that doesn't speak the language, that has its own pubs and things like that. And unfortunately, that name is baked into our identity, and we can't ever change it, probably. I've petitioned, but it won't work. So we have covered that before, what the difference is. And I would say that, if you look at someone, I don't know if you wanted to find someone who's an immigrant, if they're fleeing from a political situation or economic depression. I don't know. I think, absolutely. Our readers are a complete mix of all of these things. It's no longer just Americans and Brits at all. Because it used to be that was the case. It was just like.
But if you're from Nigeria or Kenya or Greece and you move to Prague, you're going to read in English.
Yeah,
Because
well, you
the
have
other
to. There's no other chance. Yeah.
It's like you learn Czech, and it's like, good luck, man. And then, or
3 years later, 4 or 5 years later, maybe. Yeah.
19.
Those are the people who are coming to the site, and so.
So, Evan, we also talked about it a little bit before. You sort of do partly pitching. You pitch your stories,
Yeah.
which has been
Yeah.
incredibly successful. It's about more than a half of your pitch stories actually get.
I have
Written,
I have a
right?
good ratio, I think. Yeah.
You
But I
have
don't-
you have an excellent ratio. Trust
But I don't
me.
pitch that much, so maybe if I had statistics against me, I would
Yeah.
I'd look worse.
So, how sustainable is your job? What does it really depend on?
It's not very sustainable. It's pretty tenuous. But I've been freelance only since 2006, and a lot of times
It's
there's
13 years.
yeah. And sometimes it's great, and sometimes it's not. It's definitely a feast or famine situation. There's too much work or there's not enough. It's getting harder. I was telling you before, but it still works. I get a lot of, I guess because I've done it a long time, I have people coming to me, or they say, I saw you on this show, or I read your article there. Could you write something like that?
So it's word of mouth in a way, sort of.
It's
or-
word of mouth in
yeah.
a way, and that sometimes it's a really nice publication that comes to you that way. So that's to me that way. So I've been lucky, really lucky. But for all freelancers everywhere, it's hard, and it's gonna only get harder. I think it's a difficult time for journalism, and it's going to be difficult
In general, I
for
guess,
news.
not only for freelancers. Yeah.
Exactly, it's going to be difficult not just for the workers, people who are writing either on staff or as freelancers, but for readers, it's going to get worse, or at least be more difficult because it's harder to get good news. If you're only paying half a week's wages for a story, it's not going to be as in depth as if you pay a full week's wages, and that's just a fact. So we're getting, we've gone from this kind of really great, maybe golden era of American journalism, and let's say 60s or 70s or something like that, whenever Joan Didion was still writing. And now we're getting into real, it's tough because people can't make enough money. Everybody's multitasking. No one's on staff anymore. And I think the people who are going to lose the most are readers.
Jeremy, in terms of sort of your transitions online, when was the most vulnerable time for this nonprofit? When was it?
It's one of those strange things that business is better for us when the world is worse. So, because the donors we still depend on most of our income from grants. So especially when the thought was all these countries in the EU had graduated and funding from American donors, for example, is no longer needed, things got to be more difficult. Now the donors are coming back to Central Europe. So
They should.
they should, yeah, and
really should.
they've been
They should run.
and they've been quite late to do it, but now
They
the interest
basically
is
put
coming
up a
back.
mission accomplished banner.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
It's,
more or less. So as I said, that has helped us. That there's more of a need for our work here, but for the good of society, what we do, not just the publishing arm, but a lot of what we do is just training of journalists. And in an ideal world, that side of what we do would no longer be needed, but the need has intensified, not just in Central Europe, but in the Balkans, Eastern Europe, and all these places to help out. So in that way, we've been doing it now. We'll be celebrating 20 years in the fall. And I would say that kind of model should be sustainable going forward, but we also try to make our own money. And as you were just saying, I think that there is that crisis of journalism overall, but there are, I would say, trends though that are somehow more optimistic. The idea of membership, the idea of more of the general public contributing to the production of journalism. And I think the mentality has changed a lot just in the last 5 years, not just with Trump's election, but the election of so many unsavory people into positions of power has really started to change the mentality among normal people that journalism is a public good, we need to support it. And it might always be just 5 or 10% of the population, but you mentioned before Denik N, there have been studies done showing the Czechs were unwilling to pay for online content.
Yeah,
pay for
I was going to
content.
talk about it, absolutely.
Yeah, and it really showed that they're not unwilling, but no one was asking in the right way. And Denik N already has 10,000 subscribers or members after, 6 months.
Yeah,
So,
28th of October, yeah. So,
Yeah.
8 months. But they even have more now, yeah.
yeah, so, I mean, that for me is a very positive sign, and it's not just here, it's in a lot of countries, even the Czech Republic is a well-off country, but even in much poorer places, there are people willing to pay for quality journalism. So there is that at least.
And it has been a shift, in your opinion, in the last 3 years, that not only, I don't know, the New York Times, but in general, people are willing to pay for their regional media and publications, right?
Some people, like I said, it's always a small percentage, but I think that people who are better off now see that as a worthwhile cause.
but what strikes me as interesting is that, well, in a lot of those cases where it's successful, it's not just a cause, but it's a feeling of community,
Yeah.
that people have a membership, and I support this because I'm part of this special group of people that believes in this thing. And I'm not complaining about my host country, but in the Czech Republic, people do tend to have a kind of leave me alone attitude a lot of the time, and there isn't a tendency towards joining and membership and being part of a group and so much.
But the Czech Republic, if you look at the number of organizations that are membership organizations, the so-called, it doesn't exist any longer, but there was a category called Občanské sdružení in the nonprofit world, which is civic association. And there are thousands and thousands of those organizations throughout the country. Usually it's sports or hunting or stuff like that.
I am a member of the Czech Fishing Union.
Yeah. So, but there are a lot of those kind of communities, and even if we look at something like Respect, I would say that Respect, there is a kind of strong community around Respect.
Because of the Respect Festival, because of the idea of culture and politics and music kind of fusing.
No, I mean the publication.
Yeah, I know they have the festival.
They do a lot of events around.
They have events.
That's what Eva
They have
means.
events, yeah.
Yeah, but I think it's at the core of the journalism, and people feel that is necessary in this kind of democracy to support. And it's been like that for a long time.
I write for a couple of publications which are funding themselves basically through $5 a month memberships that are not even, you're not buying anything. Reading all of the articles is free, but you're a member. And some of these have several thousand donors, and it's fantastic. I just felt like maybe it wouldn't fly so much in, not even just the Czech Republic, in this region.
Yeah.
It's
But I think even, I don't know if it's still successful, but it was doing very well for a time. The crowdfunding platform, Hit.
yeah.
right? So I think that's another.
For like books and documentaries, it's
Yeah.
getting better. Yeah, those independent projects, kind of type of thing. Yeah, yeah. What is your kind of most successful or most fascinating or strangest story you have covered in this country, Elizabeth? Like kind of the story you'll never forget.
Yeah. Well, I have to say it's the story that I was talking to you about before for American National Public Radio. It was not a radio piece, it was a written piece, but it was about a company here. They're called Mama Help, and they developed a beer to taste good to breast cancer patients. And it was really fascinating to meet with these women who said, these Czech women who said that one of the main things that they missed the most when they were going through chemo was being able to just like drink a beer. And I thought that was really telling. It had such a
amazing.
cultural hook to it, the beer angle, and also, you know, this kind of underlying idea that, you know, like I said, there's a lot of shame surrounding illness, I think, in the Czech Republic, and especially women's illness and breast cancer. And so
That's also getting better, I must say.
yeah,
but
it's
to be fair, but
absolutely getting better. And it was actually, I remember it was Zatech.
Yeah, Jota.
Yeah, it was that was the name of the brewery that developed it, and it's very sweet, and it has certain compound that kind of assuages the nausea that's associated with
Yeah.
chemotherapy, and it was designed by Zatech and in cooperation with Mama Help. So
How did you find that story? Fantastic.
I just got one of their. I follow their social media, and I just got one of their PR blasts. So this is like actually a case where PR was actually worked in.
Useful.
That's like once a year.
It
Once a
is,
year.
and I thought this is just like an amazing story because this other story I had just covered, and I had just written a news brief about it for expats, and it was like this beer designed for women. Full stop. It's just like the ladies' beer. I think the headline was "Outrage pours in over
Oh,
Czech
because
lady beer."
yeah, Melissa Cole started that.
Yeah,
That's
exactly. And so, which kind of in the Me Too era is a bit, I don't know, you know, would you drink a beer marketed towards women? I just want a regular beer.
a big deal. Yeah, that's we have
You
beer
do not
for
have
women.
to package it in a pink bottle. Come
Yeah.
on. So, and right around the same time, so I thought, wow, it would be cool to write this and to get them some recognition. And I think they were actually there was like a Prague Beer Festival at Kotva or something. It was at Kotva, associated with the Prague Beer Festival, and they were there as well. So, yeah, I mean, and that's just a great
That's
story.
fascinating.
Yeah,
that's
I
great.
think that's just a great story. So,
Evan, how about you?
Well, my favorite story that I've written was not in Czech Republic, but it was in the former Czechoslovakia, and I wrote about wooden churches in what is now Zakarpatsko. And I thought it was my last story for the New York Times because we keep changing editors, and they usually kind of like want to make a regime change. And so I went out there, and you know, it's the last part of Czechoslovakia. Was for 10 years or so, 15 years. And it was just absolutely fascinating because there were people could speak Czech, old people could still speak Czech. With me, I could get by in Czech. It wasn't a Czech Republic story, it's Ukraine, but I really enjoyed writing it, and partly because I thought I wasn't going to write another one, so I wrote the hell out of it, and it was, for me, it was successful because I enjoyed it. That was one of my favorite things that I've written, yeah. And I have a real interest in the former Czechoslovakia and just kind of the way America views it. I think I mentioned this to you. There was an article in 1938 in National Geographic that I always bring up. It was called Czechoslovaks, the Yankees of Europe. And it came out in 1938, total propaganda, but it's National Geographic magazine, you know, and it's like page after page after page of photos and maps, and there's a guy drinking a beer and it says, girls love soldiers and soldiers love beer. And this American travel writer in 1938 came to Czechoslovakia and just wrote the whole country up. He starts in Zlín, he goes around, and he's just saying, these people are like us. These people have a connection to our country. They are not Germans. They are not Hungarians. They are different. And that is partly what we're talking about here, you know, this relationship between America and the Czech Republic today. And I think that still is evident even after 81 years, you know, since that article came out.
Thank you. Jamie, what is your favorite story? Maybe not necessarily yours, since you don't write that often, but maybe one of your students or.
Yeah, well, I was trying to think of some articles that I did a long time ago, and I was thinking about one that actually represented the culture clash that some of you were talking about before. And I remember writing, because I used to write opinion pieces for the Prague Post, and writing something about Lucia Bila and the fact that she was Roma, but I think had made
Oh, yeah, I
some.
remember that piece.
Yeah, I think she had made some Roma jokes or something. And for me, I was just stunned being American. Like, how could you have someone from a minority in such a public role,
Yeah.
not highlighting the fact that she was Roma and trying to push Roma issues, and instead, I can't remember what the comments were, but it was something disparaging about Roma. And then I remember still, I had this mysterious postcard that arrived in the mail of Lucia Bila saying, with like a heart on it, saying, you know, thank you for your comments.
That's
and I found
That's fantastic.
yeah, but it wasn't from her. I found out like 10 years ago. It was 10 years later. It was from a friend of mine who was
Okay,
making.
that's even more funny.
But I do remember clearly that article, and that I didn't quite understand the culture well enough at that time, probably, to understand why that had happened.
But see that, for example, this kind of question is very interesting. The Roma question, which is kind of one of the cliches,
Yeah.
maybe. I mean, not for the three of you guys, of course, but for many of the other foreign-speaking journalists, they always like have to
Yeah.
cover it because it's like so severe here and so deep. But in the same time, we are coming to it slowly but surely. You know, after 30 years of you pushing for it, you know, there's this TV series called Most, which is finally addressing it, at least in a funny way, but which is better than nothing, and kind of balancing the stereotypes and being stereotypical about all minorities and the Czech majority, and kind of trying to address these issues, maybe, you know, in a more broader way than an article in some, you know, specialized publication. So that I was very happy to see that TV series, I have to say, in terms of like, you know, talking about things openly finally, which you have been, you know, I mean, the New York Times have been covering the Roma question. I mean, maybe not through your articles, but a lot of journalists were
If I
writing about it.
If I
so.
covered it, I would cover the Chamorro Festival. I would cover aspects of culture that would be
Which is
fun,
great too.
because
yeah.
in not writing hard news, I get to write things that are kind of always up, and I don't get to have to report that some dictator killed somebody. I get to say, this is a festival you should see, or these are acts you should listen to, or restaurants you should visit.
Yeah, yeah.
It's unfair in a way, but there are aspects of the culture that should be celebrated and talked about more.
What keeps you here? Talking about the good old 90s, you know, I mean, I put into my notes the Franz Kafka quote, which cannot be avoided, about the Prague, you know, the old witch has kind of,
Greifen.
yeah, has crowns, and it kind of, you either have to yield or else. So in other words, you know, Prague just kind of catches you and never let you go, which is kind of a true, no? There's this very funny movie, I'm sure you guys all remember, called Rex Patriots, when this group of Americans who came here from the 90s, like, is desperately trying to escape Prague, and they're like, there's a talk, if you make it to Vienna, then you can actually really leave, you know, and catch a flight to New York.
It's also one of the best, well, the most popular expat novels was written about life for expats in Budapest.
Yeah, it's called Prague.
Which was called
Oh,
Prague.
Prague, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that too.
Arthur Phillips, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I love that too. But is it true, or is it all just like, you know, the fairy tale?
Well, I wasn't here in the 90s. So are you asking
But is
just in general?
Is
Prague
Prague?
a
Is
fairy
Prague?
tale?
Yeah. Is Prague? Is Prague? Did Prague catch you forever, or?
You know, I think it just depends on when it does grab you, what phase of your life that you're in, and you know, for those of us who are here long term, I'm here because of my family, because I feel like I can live a better quality of life here, and
Keep saying that.
more, you know, I mean, there's nothing else to say, because it just is, and particularly here in Prague, you know, there's culture, and it is a bit of a fairy tale, but it's also, you know, there are these challenges, and especially when you're raising kids here, I feel that presence more of those, you know, kind of anti-immigrant sentiments, and you feel them growing, and it's scary, and kind of navigating the cultural difference. I think one issue that keeps popping up in our family is when my kids come home with like these kind of silly caricatured drawings of Native Americans and this kind of like Czech fascination with Winnetou and everything, and
But we mean well.
And I
you
know,
know what I
we
mean.
mean
We
well.
mean well. We love it.
I was discovering a story that was about this bicycle company, this Czech one, Apache.
Yeah, that was
And
terrible.
they got in really big trouble for using the likeness of an Apache Indian tribe, and they have like a model called the Scalp or something, and Czechs just didn't understand. Yeah, they thought like, what? We like, and I think you have to understand the context of that, and using it for commercial purposes is offensive, and so it's hard to navigate that and explain it to your kids. I don't know how you do it, but it always comes up.
This is
it
a
seems.
fantastic question.
I don't- what-
We still have the Redskins and the Atlanta.
Yeah, I don't think Americans are even. I mean, we're Americans ourselves are barely becoming aware of these kind of
But
issues.
I mean, Czechs
and-
take it to the next level because they don't have that kind of filter or PC kind of
Well, in terms of Native American stuff, or all ethnicities? or
at
something?
all.
Yeah.
But,
I mean, there's also the playing favorite game of the Czech kids, like hrát si na Indiány, right? When they like run around
There's
and
nothing. There's
kids
nothing
do that,
wrong
yeah.
with
and
that.
killing and trying to kill each other. So
yeah.
and it's just, I remember like my daughter had like the kindergarten in nature, as you call it,
Yes.
and they did like a whole week sort of project about the Indians, and there were a couple of American kids, and they were surprised about it. It's true. So
Yeah, I mean, to me, I think it's good to talk about it, but these are just, I think, the little hot issues that pop up around living in the Czech Republic, and all worth it though. I mean, yeah.
Evan, what keeps you here, and were you ever trying to leave for good?
Yeah, I thought I was going to be here for a year originally when I moved here, and then another year, and then another year. But it didn't take very long for me to realize I had everything I wanted here. And in the past few years, I've really come to feel very appreciative of living in Prague and living in the Czech Republic. And I feel like life is getting better here. That things are improving. That the schools are good. The quality of life seems to be improving. They fixed the sidewalk in front of our house. One day they will fix the D1, between Prague and Brno. One day.
One day after we retire,
No, I think I really, really like living here, and I like a lot of things about the Czech Republic other than Prague. I love South Bohemia. I love being down there. My wife's family is from down there. My wife and the kids just left, but I'm here for my family, but we could easily move to the States, or we could live here, and we feel like we have a better quality of life. We're happier here. Just in terms of, we were talking about diversity and things, and I've shared this a couple days ago on Twitter that my kids go to a school where about a third of the population of students are native language Italian speaking. And they have native...
How come?
Because there are a lot of Italians in Prague. And so they have a school, and
You know about Prague much more than we, the Czechs.
so they have 3 classes for every grade, and one of those classes is half in Italian and half in English. Czech, sorry. And the Italian is native language Italian teacher. A guy from Italy who's a teacher, and he's teaching in Italian. He teaches Italian language and history. Then they switch into Czech language for science and math and whatever. And my daughter's best friend, though, is from Korea. And all of these kids, their native language is Czech. They're shared language. So there's like Luigi, I kid you not, Luigi and Rebecca. And then there's Cheon, who's from Seoul, and my daughter, Mary Marushka, who technically is like one of the only Czechs who's going to get a Native American card, right? She's Native American. And they're all speaking Czech as their language. It's a great place to live. It's absolutely
a special
fantastic.
feeling. It definitely is.
There's a big hope in that.
I just
I would say,
like a half American girl and a Korean girl, and us parents, we don't even know how to talk to each other, and they're just running off and playing little games in Czech.
sounds optimistic.
It's perfect.
Jeremy, what keeps you here besides your mission?
Yeah, well, I thought you were going to ask about the glory years of the '90s. So I do think that was like a perfect storm at the time, just for a lot of us of where we were in our lives, and the fact that we were right out of college, and
Sure.
especially for those of us interested in journalism, it was so much more interesting to come over to a country going through a transition than to start off with some small paper in the U.S. And the fact that so much was going on, and it was so exciting for us. I mean, for Czechs, obviously, it was much more of a, I wouldn't say life or death, but it was much, the issues were much deeper. For us, it was what's going to happen in this country. It's kind of Wild West. There were no, I always tell my students, it wasn't clear at the time that this country would end up to be a member of the European Union, NATO. Back in '92,
No, that's a very good point.
we just had no idea what direction things were going. We hoped it was going that direction, but we weren't so sure. And again, I was saying, as a journalist, I was doing stuff for a publication called the U.S. News and World Report once in a while, and I was getting paid $500 to write 300 words, and could live off of that for a couple weeks. So, probably a month, and pay rent from it as well. So it was such an exciting time to be here, and before we all had mortgages and had to worry about things like that. So I think that is part of why many of us look back and reminisce so strongly about those times. But it was also the way Americans were welcomed in those days too. Really with open arms.
Also a very good point. Yeah.
With open arms. And one of the first things I remember learning how to say in Czech was, I'm not German, I'm American. Because the Germans were the ones that were getting the brunt of the criticism from Czechs, because there were huge groups of young Germans coming to the Czechoslovakia for the first time, speaking very loudly, acting like they owned the place. Not Americans can do that as well, and do it very well. But most of the people at that time who were doing that, a lot of the younger people were German, and it's been sad to see it turned at least part of the population. Like, I agree, it's great that we see this multiculturalism spreading, but there are many areas of the country where it hasn't spread yet. And one thing we do is, as I mentioned before, is we work a lot in this area of disinformation. And a lot of it, I think people know, is spread through email here, through these chain emails, especially among older people. And it's been shocking to see the anti-Americanism in those emails, which are spread
Very much so,
among the followers of SPD and a lot of others who feel left behind in the transition. And I just received one, because we collect these emails to study them, as it were. And one of the messages had a couple kind of memes that were directly anti-American, talking about how the European Union was based on a model which didn't work in America, which meant eliminating all the natives at its origin or something like that we should get rid of all the natives. And another one was about America being at war for most of its existence. And which is true to some extent, but the way the narratives are told,
16 years without war,
and a lot of the narratives are directed at the American embassy, American political correctness, the ways that's interpreted, which is just very different. So again, in Prague, probably we're still treated quite well, and people will be happy to talk to us. But I think if you go and meet now a large chunk of the nation out in the regions, you won't have that kind of reception. And 20 years ago, you still would have. My personal opinion.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
my father-in-law's town is Pisac, and it was liberated by the Yanks, and it still feels a little. It's not like everyone's waving an American flag, but on May 5th and 6th, they're all waving American flags and driving Jeeps around.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any questions, please?
It's not really a question, more a couple of comments. My name is Julian Nagel. I was a reporter, American reporter here in the 1980s and 90s and early 2000s, and I left Prague for 14 years to go to Kosovo to work for the UN. And I've found this discussion fascinating, enlightening, even more interesting than I expected it to be. It jogged my memory, and I'd like to just say a few things, remarks to what has been said here. One thing that hasn't been said, and I think we should give some credit, is the name Alan Levy has not been mentioned. And he obviously was an inspiration for some of us.
It's on the list.
Whether positively or not quite so positively, he was your boss.
My boss. I worked with Alan for 6 years.
He inspired me as a teenager already. In the early 70s, I read his Rowboat to Prague, the original edition, this thick.
Fantastic.
I mean, I was already fascinated with the place, but he showed me that it was possible to actually come here. And I started coming in 1973, between my freshman and sophomore year in college, and in the summer for a few days, and then I kept coming back every year, and then I moved to Europe in end of 1980, and I was coming in monthly, first as a business reporter, and subsequently I got hired by VOA in '84. And I was closely followed, which goes without saying. For me, the 90s, this is where I'll differ with you. Yes, it was fascinating in the early 90s, but once the country broke up, the common state of Czechoslovakia, the magic was gone, regardless of whether Havel went back to the castle after that. The 80s were an evil time, but there was so much to write and so little time and so much going on everywhere else. What all one could say after '92 was, thank God for the collapse of Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union. There was enough to be written, because what was going on here was, I found it interesting, but it was difficult to persuade my editors at Voice of America, who were obviously broadcasting in all the languages of the region, that there was really much to say anymore here. There were human interest stories. Things were going swimmingly in comparison to almost anywhere else, even Visegrad, which I covered in its inception. And it was a very different operation then than it now is. Americans were viewed very differently. I was invited to a reception shortly after I moved here in the spring of 1990 by a neighbor who was the head of a small political party that was within the National Front, which had just been disbanded, and his wife introduced me to the guests as the most eligible bachelor in Prague because I was the VOA correspondent and I was single. It was the first and last time I ever got that. Anyway, to keep this short, I was also invited to country radio for an interview. I walked into the studio and there was a huge Confederate flag.
Yeah, I don't get that.
You can't be serious.
I keep explaining that to Czech people.
They don't get it.
I keep telling them that's not okay.
That's not okay.
It's not.
You know, I mean, I come from Manhattan. I don't New York.
It doesn't matter where you're from.
No, exactly. No, I know, but some parts of the South, it's still it's in the state flag.
Yeah,
but
it's
for me,
Georgia,
it was a slap in the face.
Ja jsem rebel, but they'll say that. Ja jsem rebel.
Yeah.
Like, well,
Exactly.
yeah, but that's a racist flag.
I was invited on another radio station interview with a Roma host, and we spoke about Roma issues for half an hour, and then there were phone-ins. Actually, it was state radio. I don't remember which one, but anyway, there were phone-ins, and it was live, and I was scared. I mean, this was, how can you say that that people should invite Roma into their homes for dinner to get to know their neighbors better? Just try it, you'll see that your silverware won't be there when they leave, and things like that. I was embarrassed for the host, but I mean, it was completely normal. Now, these weren't things I was writing about. I simply became more respectful. And one last remark I would make. I was invited several times to Czechoslovak and then Czech TV during election night, local Czechoslovak Czech parliamentary elections. They didn't want to hear my opinion about Czech or Czechoslovak politics. That's why I went there hoping to be able to put in my 2 cents. No. In 1990 or 92, the last thing they wanted was an American to give his opinion about local politics. They wanted to know, well, how do you do it in America?
Mm.
You know, and I'm no expert in American politics anymore. I studied it almost 50 years ago, but no, that's the only thing they were willing to discuss with me. Today, it's a little different.
Yeah.
But it's a very different political scene today. The 90s started out with tremendous hope and descended from bad to worse, and then 99 with the Kosovo conflict. Anyway, I'll stop it there. But thank you. It's been fascinating.
It's fascinating to hear, yeah.
Thank you so much.
I remember Alan Levy. I worked with Alan for 6 years, and he is the guy who came up with or claimed to have come up with the Prague is the left bank of the 90s.
Yeah, and so he did, I believe, because it was in the very first
No, there were
issue
always
of the
rumors.
Prague
There were always
Post.
rumors that somebody else said it first.
Well, tell us
Alan's-
more.
and
Tell us
Alan-
more. I believe that fairy tale because it was written in the very first issue of the Prague Post, right?
That's
in
right.
his
It
open
was.
ad.
Yeah,
so.
yeah. There's an old joke about Pancho Villa where he says, "Did you know Pancho Villa?" And he says, "Did I know him? I had lunch with him." And I had lunch with Alan a lot, and he was a real inspiration to us. We joked about Alan, or we were frustrated by Alan, and I worked with him for 6 years, and he could be a real pain in the ass. But there were things we really respected about Alan. He was a hustler. And as a journalist, we are sloth-like, lazy creatures by nature, right? But he was a stone-cold hustler. He would go out and get assignments. He wrote a profile of this German actress, the one about Run Lola Run. That actress, she was in Prague. He got an interview with her and published it in Black Book magazine, which was like GQ or something. And we were going, well, how did he get that assignment? And he did it for 2 generations. He lived an entire life in Europe. And it was eye-opening to me to meet other expat freelancers and writers they didn't work with Alan. And those of us who worked with Alan would kind of say, this crazy old man, I liked Alan, but sometimes people would complain. But I would meet people who didn't know Alan, and they had so much respect for him because of his hustling, because of his work, because of actually getting the assignments and writing the stories. Yeah.
Just a really quick comment. Yeah.
Sure.
Good to see you as well. It's been a long time. Just what you were saying about reporting from here in the 90s, I definitely felt at some point there were so many American journalists running around and they did get tired of us, which is why I actually like going down to Slovakia after the country split, because no one would ever go down to Slovakia to talk to people in those days. And the fact that we would go there and interview people and bother. The Slovaks Slovaks are very warm people in many ways as well, but they were so happy to see us that we had actually made the effort to come down to from Prague and talk to them. So
I think it's still that way.
It's
I think
still
it's
that
still
way?
that way.
That was the case in the 80s.
Was it? Okay. Yeah. I thought it was me. No, it wasn't me. Okay.
But I think Alan Levy was kind of this, incredibly important historical figure, which is gonna be, written forever in the history books. I believe that's kind of without a question. No, like
Yeah.
whether no matter like what kind of a person he was, he really did give a starting point to a lot of American journalists in this country. So you guys could
Yeah.
find your starting
Yeah,
ground here, to find your feet here.
Yeah, he was a lot of fun. Really super frustrating. There are people who really, did not want to be interviewed by Alan, and he kept pursuing them because it would make his career if he could get an interview with them, and they were just like, no, I would rather not, and he just kept pursuing them, and that's this guy, right? So Alan was doggedly trying to get interviews with Václav Havel, and when I was working at the Post, and he didn't get one at the time. I remember that. He was fun. I went to lunch with him many times. I was at his 70th birthday party. He definitely did a lot for training journalists, for being a sort of elder statesman or eminence grise among journalists, like him or not. Matt Welch used to complain about his columns regularly on his blog, but he read them. I miss Alan. It's been a while.
Yeah, I was just saying, I think if it wouldn't be him and the Prague Post, you guys, probably not too many of you would have stayed here, I think, because then this kind of stable collaboration with one publication gave you some sort of a sense of a security in a way.
By the time-
not security, but a reason to stay here for a longer time.
By the time I got to the Prague Post in 2000, I started working there. Alan was not running the paper at all.
Anymore,
No, he was a columnist, and he had the title of editor-in-chief, but he was really tangential and marginalized. And he wasn't that old then. It was before his 70th birthday. Before, I think he had a bigger hand in things, but by the time I got here in 2000, he was just sort of an elder statesman. And we would go to lunch and we'd talk about work, or we'd argue about where to put commas in a sentence with more than 3 elements, and things like that.
Any other questions for you guys? Marketa?
I have a question. All of you have been here for a long time. Is there, and talking about cultural clash and stuff, is there something, or what thing for each of you is it that makes it a little bit difficult to deal with Czech people? What is the thing that
It's a
you
trap.
have not learned
is a
to
trap.
accept or something? It's a trap, or what is it? What is it kind of that it's hard to get used to, or what is it? What is kind of difficult? What has been difficult, or what makes us very different, or
I think
whatever?
off the top of my head, oftentimes when I'm interviewing someone, and I don't know if this is just me because I talk a lot, or if it's just the nature of Czech people, but I often get these like very brief, like 1 or 2 word responses when I'm hoping for so much more, and so I often kind of feel like Czechs are very sparse with language.
Yeah, maybe it gets better later.
It is definitely
That's what
the
usually
English word, but
is
I
the
know.
case, right? You don't have to answer, Evan. You don't have to answer this.
I
I don't.
recognize the inherent danger.
No.
Please, Chairman.
The last couple of years have been difficult, I think, just because of all the anti-migrant sentiment and just the amount of disinformation that spreads. And this isn't really just for me. I mean, I know I've spoken to a lot of Czechs who say, I can no longer speak to my mother. I can no longer speak to my grandmother because of all of the information spreading through these emails and other ways, which those kind of opinions were hidden before, and I think we're not as out in the open and somehow encouraged now in the public sphere the way they are, not by the political class as well. I mean, there's many things that are said today that would not have been said before, at least publicly, that have now become acceptable. And I think so those kind of discussions with Czechs, and I mean, even like I live on the outskirts of Prague, and we, the guys in the neighborhood tend to go to the local pub. And I think, I feel rather integrated now. I speak Czech, we hang out. Of course, as I was saying before, I think you were saying maybe your experiences with Czech women, that it took a while to get to know each other. So in my community, I mean, I'm from New York City, I'm from Brooklyn, so it's not like we have like suburban apple pie parties to welcome new people coming to our community. But it took 3 years for the neighbors to get to know each other in our community, which is kind of new, built by Central Group, one of these developments where we all moved in. It took 3 years of walking by each other's houses and saying Dobrý den to finally start hanging out and getting to know each other. But now we're at a point where we do go to the pub and stuff like that, and I feel integrated. But when the migrant crisis developed, we were out in the pub, and it was at the time, if people remember, when the migrants were streaming into Hungary, and Hungary was really tough and started firing tear gas and stuff. And one of the neighbors was kind of baiting me, it was like a trap, like you just said. What do you think? Because they know I'm a journalist, and said, what do you think about what's happening there? And I said, well, yeah, it's really tough, right? It's like collective guilt. Like all these people are, coming together, and they're treating them, all of them, by firing tear gas. There are women there and so on. And he said, you know what? I actually think that they're not tough enough. And you and your American political correctness. And that was like a neighbor who said that to me, who I'd known quite well. And suddenly I was the American again, after feeling maybe I had exaggerated my sense of Czechness. But that was a time where it was difficult. Yeah. And this was what was so disappointing. This was a guy who worked for an American company for many years, traveled. Those types of citizens or people that should be more open, right? Not people living off in a village, never having met a foreigner, only reading disinformation sites and so on. So.
Okay,
Thank
we
you.
can't finish with this sad story. I refuse to finish with, so there is 2 more questions. Good. Thank you, though.
Thank you. I think you slightly escaped from the trap because it's maybe not a Czech experience. You may get the similar experience in some parts of America with nowadays politics. It's more culture. But I have another trap for you.
Don't say it before.
That's why those people
Pro tip.
came here today to get you into a trap.
I was wondering whether you are in contact with Czech journalism, not only American journalism, but Czech journalism. And if you could recommend, or if you see in Czech media, a newspaper or magazine that would fulfill American standards of journalism, as you said, in-depth story for 1 week, work on it. If there is anything like that, or what would you recommend in Czech?
I love Respect. I think it's great. And I struggle through it myself with my Czech, but I think it's great. You probably know more about this. This is your.
Yeah, I can at least end for me with a positive note. I was saying to Veronica, I'm also on the board of these Czech journalism prizes here, Novinářská cena, and it does amaze me each year, the collection of good work being done here. There are a lot of pressures on Czech media. We were talking about them before. Life of freelancers is very difficult in this country. The fact that there's no strong union defending journalists' interests. Obviously, the ownership question is really bad. But I don't think the level of I don't want to generalize too much, but there are a lot of Czech journalists now that practice the craft of journalism at a level similar to Western Europe, America, wherever you want to look. And if you look, if you go to the Novinářská cena page and you look at the prize winners, it's really good stuff. I mean, there's really good work being done here by Czech television, Czech radio, Respekt, Deniken, Reporter, Hledací pes. There's a lot of good work here. So I don't think that's the big problem now. I think there's enough good quality Czech journalists around. So.
Yeah, one more quick question.
Sure.
Thank you so much for being here. I've been living in Černov, north of Prague, for the past 10 months on a Fulbright fellowship teaching English at a high school. And besides all of these things that you have mentioned, one thing that has really caught my attention is this, that's kind of related to the Native American fascination, is the tramping movement. I have quite a few colleagues who were tramps, and every weekend when I come back to the train station, I see people with their backpacks wearing the military uniforms, and I've just heard a lot of fascinating stories about that, and I wondered if any of you had covered stories about this or had recommendations about where to go for more information on this.
Well, I can just jump in really quickly because I think there's a documentary by Margot from, I don't know if she did it for Radio Free Europe, or do you know Margot Buff?
Yeah.
She did a documentary on this, on tramping, and I can't remember where it was screened. It's been on Czech television.
Yeah, and there's
few times.
and there's also an absolutely fascinating essay by Brett Wetzler or something like that. Do you know the name? It's about it's called Eating Sausages in Bohemia or something, and it's about this group of Brett Wetzler, and it's a guy who gained 15 pounds during writing this feature because he because he drank so much beer and ate so many sausages that he just gained weight. He basically coincidentally met a group of tramps on the train station here in Smíchovské nádraží and just spent 2 months with them somewhere. And there's so much, talked about the stereotyping of the Wild West, and how those misinformation kind of travel over the ocean with a completely wrong concept. So yeah, I mean, it's an older article, 2000, but it's fascinating. Yeah, I think it's online actually. But probably Eva knows the most about it.
I'm not sure I do, but no, I mean, I've had colleagues who are at the university who study it in a sociological component, and how it was a way for people to express individuality, especially after the communist takeover after 48. So it was a way for people to be alone and be themselves and have a lot more autonomy than they would at work or school or in society. And then you have these kind of, they're sort of related, but these cottage settlements. What is it, Osada or something like that?
Settlements,
Yeah, where people actually had autonomy and they actually had laws, and they even under normalization they were living a kind of parallel life where they were actually a much more democratic, and it was a way for them to practice democracy, but it was all on the DL. And it's kind of related to tramping and how that comes out, I think, and also just a fascination for tramping, a fascination with American West and wilderness and stuff like that. Interesting. It relates to the two countries having something in common.
Thank you for that question. Is there anything? There was okay. Eyebrow raised. I thought in a little bit of disappointment that we are coming slowly towards an end. Is there a question?
Yes, I have one question. In the morning when I was waking up, I thought I'm going to meet my American friends. So about 4 years ago, I bought the American flag. But when the Trump came to power, I never take it with myself to
I
the
threw it away.
So if I can show it now as a compliment, thank you very much for the very nice speech. And I have it here, so I'm a little bit shy, but if it's possible.
We would like to see that flag.
I don't know.
Oh, it's actually an American flag.
Yes.
Yeah.
Where did you buy this flag?
We have a shop called Viking, and there's Tibet and everything.
Yeah, Tibet has to be a big seller.
I bought it when American
I see a lot of this.
How much did it cost?
$5.
Oh wow.
Very
Oh,
nice.
that's fantastic. We would have wondered. Yeah, no, we couldn't end up better. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, Evan, Jeremy. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much.